All right. Good evening and welcome to tonight's event hosted by Pluto Press featuring the legendary Lorenzo Kom'boa Ervin. Tonight we're going to be discussing Lorenzo's extraordinary life from being a former Black Panther to evading authorities, hijacking a plane to Cuba, being captured by the CIA, and the subsequent 15-year stretch that Lorenzo did in prison, and how all of those experiences inspired him to write his landmark book, which I have next to me here, Anarchism and the Black Revolution, recently released for the first time in a definitive edition by Pluto Press. Go out and pick this book up if you have not picked it up already. But also, we're going to be talking about how Lorenzo got to the point that he became the person that he is today. We're going to be talking about a lot of life and development things that led up to that point. So we want to get into it and have a good discussion, and we're looking forward to it. My name is William C. Anderson. I'm an author and activist who has learned a lot from Lorenzo over the years and have been fortunate enough to think and grow alongside him, especially in these moments, these very disturbing moments of this pandemic. So looking forward to this conversation quite a bit. Lorenzo, are you there? Can you hear me?
I'm here.
Awesome. How are you doing today, man?
Oh, well, I'm doing, great. I mean, as far as everything, like you said, that I've gone through up to this point, everything is great now.
Yeah. Well, this is a moment for us to talk about some different parts of your life. I feel like the last time we talked, we were having a lot of discussions about a lot of the more known highlights of your life. But today I kind of want to get into some of the specifics about Black history and about your early life, your childhood, what moments led up to you being a young adult who, committed these revolutionary actions that you did. So one of the first questions I wanted to ask you today for people, it's Black History Month, wanted to ask you to tell me about the politics of your childhood and what did you see growing up in the Jim Crow South? What was it like, experiencing segregation, and what did it make you want for the world? Tell me about that.
Well, you can say that segregation was a continuing indignity. And by that I mean every day it was a source of humiliation. A white man could come up and spit in your face. He could kill you. The white power structure in the community could and did commit all kinds of impunity crimes, And for me, the thing that always stood out in my mind was the acts of violence. When I was 5 years old and I was living in Chattanooga, Tennessee, white racists set our house on fire. We were living in a majority white area, actually. My family worked for a Catholic parochial school, and the Catholics were fairly progressive in terms of rights of Black people. They didn't especially hate Black people, and we were living on the grounds of this school, and some whites didn't like that, and they came and set the place on fire. And we got out. We barely got out with our lives, and we lost everything as far as the house and the contents. And so, in a way of speaking, that is typical of the kind of things that I went through, that I experienced throughout my life. That led to later the continuous living conditions that I had to live under in a housing project where it's bad enough that Black people were oppressed generally in the South, especially as they had no rights that white people were bound to respect. That was what the white government And the Supreme Court had said years ago that Black people had no rights that the white government and community were bound to respect. So we were living under conditions really of extreme oppression. And, you know, when people don't have enough food, when they're impoverished, when they're oppressed, then they also can turn against those of their own kind. And, you know, we see this right now in terms of, you know, shootings of Black people by other Black people, or we see other acts of violence against, you know, the Black community in an attempt to, for instance, get rich, enrich themselves, or to just act out with their anger and so forth and so on. It's a trap. You know, the racism and the structure that racism creates, you know, it's not just as some white people, some Black people will think it's just a matter of in somebody's head. It's actually a structure. And that's what segregation was in that period. It was a structure of racial oppression. And I always point out the fact that the government was doing this. This wasn't being done by just, you know, a special group of racist whites. These people were in the government. The people who financed the Ku Klux Klan, I always like to point out to people that the White Citizens Council were the people who had power, who had prestige, who came from the so-called best families. Well, they would finance the Ku Klux Klan to terrorize the Black community, to try to prevent us from enjoying any human or democratic rights. And so that's the world I grew up in, and filled with terror, filled with racism, filled with violence against Black people at any time, which I'm not going to say that has not changed, or some things have obviously changed in terms of democratic rights, but we still face the violence of the government. And I always make the point that I'm not talking about individual white people. I always make that point. I recognize a long time ago, you know, when I became an activist and when somebody politically educated me, that it isn't just individual white people we're fighting. We're fighting a system where there are people profiting from our misery. There have been people profiting from the very beginning when they brought us here. Wait, even before they brought us here from Africa, you know, the passage over was all about money, creating an industry and an economy in the so-called New World. And so they profited from our misery. And after slavery was over, those hundreds of years of oppression, they profited from other forms of oppression linked to our condition: economic, social, political, and of course, financial. And so the system is the enemy. So I recognized that at a young age. I recognized by the time I was 10 years old, and fortunately I had the civil rights movement on television every day. I had, you know, young people protesting all over the country in the 1960s. And young Black people who our families and our communities had been stifled and crushed for years, terrorized that we should never stand up against white power.
And you got involved at a pretty young age, right? You were how old when you first would say you were getting involved in the civil rights movement?
By the time I was 10 years old, I was actually considering myself some sort of activist. I didn't fully understand what an activist was, but I knew it was linked to protest. And I was clearly in full protest against the white power structure, which is what it was in the South. It was a white power structure. And the government was the government was running this racist system. It wasn't individual whites necessarily. You know, you had rich whites that profited from it, but, you know, there was an actual government administration that was doing this stuff. And it's important to say that because some people still are perplexed to this day. They think it was just a group of racists like the Ku Klux Klan or some other group of, you know, of racist whites, some particular racist whites not understanding that the entire economy and the political structure was based on our oppression. So I saw this as a young man and responded to it, responded also to the fact that Black people at that time, well, the late 1950s and, and into the 60s, have been called the Black radical protest period, 50s, I don't know, 55 to 75, somewhere around in there. It's been generally accepted as that period when we came from just the formative stage of fighting segregation, racial segregation. And when the racial segregationist laws were defeated, then stepped up to the idea of fighting racism and for Black liberation, in the latter stages with Black power. Well, with the new civil rights movement in 1960, which was youth-based, and I always make the distinction, there's two civil rights periods there in that period in the 50s and 60s. And they were not the same organization, they were not the same movement, and they didn't practice the same tactics. And in 60, with the sit-ins, which were occupations of white racist businesses, and there was a challenge to the entire community from the Black community. And but there were young people who were not bound by the old ideas of nonviolence. In fact, they had the old wing had to fight to try to keep us within the so-called confines. And so myself as a young person at 10 years old when the sit-ins came to my city, but it was spreading all over the South, we saw what was happening. My cousin was older than I was. He was a high school student. He was in the high school, the so-called Black high school that started the protests in my hometown. And this set off a series of events where Black people all over the city rose up in a form of protest to defend the students, but also demand the rights that they'd been denied so many years. So they jumped in support of the students, working class Black people, as well as, young people all over the city, whether we were in high school, whether we were in junior high or even elementary schools. We became part of that protest and went downtown, and we were met by the police before we could get into town with high pressure water hoses. We were met with police dogs, vicious police dogs that they loosed on us, and and also tear gas bombs and so forth. We were met with that to try to prevent us from getting into the city center. And we didn't get in that day, but we kept fighting, kept putting pressure on the white authorities and the police, that they eventually had to submit, to the students' original demands.
Right.
And this is how, I was shaped to be a lifelong radical and activist. When I saw people who had been oppressed and who had been silenced and terrorized for so many years, rise up, become, take on a new suit of armor and rise up against white racist oppression.
And something you're saying there too that I want to touch on, not to cut you off, but there's something about our families, our Black families, especially Black families in the South, and a lot of the types of ways that people resisted that were so confrontational and were not submissive in the way that the popular narrative of Black history and kind of the romantic view of the civil rights movement positions Black people as docile and weak and kind of submissive and subservient and always nonviolent. And you're touching on something here too about this history where people were confrontational, especially young Black people, like, with the Children's Crusade in my hometown in Birmingham. you know, a lot of that was not just nonviolent protest. A lot of people were actually armed. A lot of people were actually willing to confront the white power structure in a way that I think often gets lost. And it seems like you're touching on some of that, and also connecting this understanding of the state being the ultimate purveyor of this violence that you were confronting at a very, very young age.
Well, it's important for the state afterwards to come along and to try to justify and distort the actual aims of the movement and the history of the struggle. It's important that they do that because that's in their interest. It's not in our interest. Even Dr. King becomes a much more, you know, weak individual, or someone that's concerned about peace at the expense of justice. You know, it's always in their interest. Now, interestingly, the stuff that happened in Chattanooga happened in 1960, but the things that happened in Birmingham didn't happen in 63, 4. And the things that happened in Birmingham, you know, the high pressure water hose and all that was being done in Chattanooga during the first sit-ins that took place there.
Right.
And it's not even known at all, because the government took it upon itself. In its report, they said that we're going to call this, what happened in Chattanooga, we're going to call this a riot. We're not going to call it a sit-in. Right. So it's a conscious idea, an effort to depict it in a certain way and to leave it lost to history, except for those of us who participated in it. And that's what most people don't know about it. They know about Birmingham, they see it all the time. They want to get sympathy for the liberal perspective, because the liberals control the world and the government at that time, you know, in the 1960s and the time before. It's been only since Reagan was the first so-called conservative president. Let's not lose track of that. And so what wound up happening is that the liberal form of government was defeated ideologically by the Black Power and Civil Rights movement. The Black movement actually defeated it. I mean, it's important to be able to sum things up. It's just like we're summing up my life and history somewhat, and my life and history is only related to the larger issues that was you know, impacting society at that time. You know, if you look at SNCC, let's say in 1960, when it, you know, actually consolidated the movement of young Black activists that had been having protests all over the South, and Sister Ella Baker, you know, who was an important activist in her own right, and she's another one of those persons that was her whole history and her life, activism, was muted because she was a radical figure. She was uncompromising, and she also did not accept the ideas of Dr. King and others as some kind of messiah or some sort of you know, figure that was unquestionable. She believed that the people themselves made the struggle, and the people didn't need so-called strong leaders or representatives on their behalf. They needed, the people needed their own voices and their own ability to use their organizations to impact history and to impact the conditions in their community. That's what she believed. And she taught all the youth in SNCC. She taught us that. You know, she taught people that. I didn't get into SNCC until later, but she taught everyone that the movement should be built upon the work they've already started, not under the aegis of King or the leadership of King or anyone else. Build your own movement and start to change the world, start to change the communities you live in, and get other young people to make a tidal wave of protests. And effectively, that's what happened. I mean, you know, we went through the first several years after 60 of protests all over the South, much more militant protests than there had been with Dr. King and you know, in the 1950s, middle 1950s. And then that movement transformed after, you know, I guess maybe 64, 65, it became a Black Power organization. And it became even more militant and dropped nonviolence altogether, and started practicing and advocating for armed self-defense. Now, you were saying about the protests and how they were not all peaceful and meek and all that. In point of fact, there were many instances going back a long time from the early stages of the civil rights movement where there had been armed groups that would march with the protesters to keep the Ku Klux Klan and other white racist organizations from attacking them and killing people, or attacking and wounding people, whatever the case may be.
Right,
so they would march on the outside. The Deacons for Defense and Justice is one that we know of in this period. But even before that, in Monroe, North Carolina, there was the Black Armed Guard, which was created by Mabel and Robert Williams.
Right.
So there have always been these things. I mean, I was influenced by a lot of this stuff at an early age. When I first even heard of it, it excited the hell out of me because I was opposed to nonviolence. I was not with it from, I understood it as a means of protest, but I was not captured or, encapsulated by it. And a lot of youth in that period were the same way. They were not in love with nonviolence. They understood later on how the government used the whole concept of nonviolence to weaken the movement, to weaken the struggle, make it more about accommodationism or about just rights from the government and so forth and so on. Instead of liberation, there's a difference. It's a different. Malcolm X explained to us what the difference was actually. While he was alive, he took great pains to explain it. And his training, his theoretical training that he gave to young people at that time had a great deal to do with later, the movement that came later after SNCC. SNCC became, like I said, a Black Power organization. Then it linked up with the Black Panther Party. This was not an accident. It was, in fact, a transformation from one stage of protest to the other. Now, I was influenced by all this stuff. I wasn't involved with everything, to be quite honest, but I was influenced by it and seeing it and, playing whatever role I could play at that time. In the South, there wasn't even a Black Panther Party in the period we're talking about in 66, 67, or 68. It didn't exist. But I used to get, they were linked with SNCC. The leadership of SNCC, the leadership of the Black Panther Party, when it was created, actually drafted the leadership of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and key activists, and opened the door for other activists to come in. So they had a what some people call an alliance, some people call it a coalition. So who knows? It's just that they were linked together historically at that particular point in time. And training of organizers is extremely important. And this is an example of it. This 2-year period with SNCC was, in this alliance or coalition or merger or whatever you want to call it. Some people denounce it. It never happened because it was the first ideological split in the movement, and was brought on by COINTELPRO, as many things were in that period. I'm sorry, I'm taking the questioning away from you.
Yeah. I was about to say, like, let me try to jump. I'm trying to jump back in and get some more questions in, because you already actually started kind of going in. You mentioned Ella Baker, you mentioned Robert F. Williams. Who were some other people? Because I think that there is a bit of a disconnect where people might assume, because of Black anarchism being conceived a certain way in people's minds, that they might think that you don't draw inspiration from anybody except classical European anarchists, and they might lose sight of the fact of the larger journey that took you across a lot of different phases of movement, that took you across a lot of ideologies and a lot of different parts of the political spectrum. So one of the things I want to ask you is, who are some of the other people that you feel heavily influenced by in this early stage of your life? You mentioned Ella Baker. That makes a lot of sense. Obviously, Ella Baker's questioning of leadership and authority and emphasis on people, the power of people together. That makes a lot of sense, I think, for Black anarchists to draw inspiration as well as Robert F. Williams. Who else would you say were very influential people to you in your young adulthood and your youth?
Well, I was also influenced by Willie Ricks, because Willie Ricks left Chattanooga and became a traveling organizer, something I wasn't able to do. I was younger, and I wasn't able to do it. My family certainly wouldn't allow me to become a traveling organizer at 12, 13 years old, But he was one of the organizers that joined SNCC in the early stages, for sure. And he met Ella Baker, and he organized with these groups in all over the South, and so he was an instrumental figure and a source of inspiration for me and for other young Black people in Chattanooga, where we were still forced to deal with racism and racial violence and all this stuff, even after some of the most obvious forms of segregation had been beaten down by the late 60s. I don't know, maybe 60s, starting 66, 67. Radical ideas started permeating into the South, and SNCC was instrumental for that, because they were a Southern-based organization primarily. And so I would say Willie Ricks was important to me as someone out of my own hometown, someone I actually had knew about, was friends with his brother and so forth, and was able to look at some of the things that he did in a larger context, and I think that his participation in the struggle when it took place, and his association with what I'll call him Stokely Carmichael, that's what he was at the time, had a direct impact in the radical wing of SNCC growing, Black Power wing, or what have you. And actually, the effect of that Black Power wing was that the organization, which had been a multiracial organization in the earlier stages, actually transformed and became an all-Black organization. And many people felt that should have been in the first place, an all-Black organization. But it happened that way because the then leadership of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at the early stages recruited whites to come and join the movement in the South, especially in Mississippi, Freedom Summer. So it happened like that. But they felt that that period had gone by the late 1960s, and it would call for a new kind of organization. And so, Black Power came along, like I said, and SNCC was important in the sense that it was the link between all these periods. The early 1960s, when the sit-ins took place, it was grouped around SNCC. Then later, with the period of Black Power in the South and in the country, and of course, it lasted on its own for many number of years and transformed from its origins in the South to being much larger. And then, of course, Black activism, radical Black activism with the Black Panther Party, and not only the Black Panther Party, but other organizations as well in that period. The Black Power was some people try to depict it as a cultural organization or something or other, but it encompassed culture, the Black poetry and so forth and so on. But there was a radical wing of the Black Power movement. And that radical wing included groups like the Black Panther Party, League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Ultimately, that's what it became. These were workers in the automobile plants in Detroit and other cities in the North, and in the South, in Atlanta as well. And so it was an important organization in its own right as a link between these three historical periods from 60 to 70, somewhere around in there, when they were linked with, when they were part of the Black Panther Party or linked with the Black Panther Party. They had a separate existence as well. Right. And that's a long story about that.
Right.
But so it helped build it. So it helped build the Black Panther Party.
And so just to draw some connections for people, you're showing the link here between these two different phases, and you're talking about, for example, there's the connection with the foundation of the Black Panther Party, kind of drawing inspiration from the Lowndes County movement and the Black Panther icon in Alabama. There's also in your with Kwame Ture, and then your formerly Stokely Carmichael, and Willie Ricks, now Mukasa Dada, who coined the phrase Black Power. Mm-hmm. And this is a really interesting connection to what I wanted to ask you about next. When you start to go forward and further in your radicalization, and you are eventually a Maoist, and you are taking on a different perspective in terms of your revolutionary perspective, your radicalization growing, what leads you to the point where you decide that you're ready to commit revolutionary acts? What leads you to this place where you don't feel hesitant to do that as much anymore, where you are ready to get to a place where you're ready to commit revolutionary acts? And how did you overcome that fear?
Well, by 1965, with the rise of the Black Power movement, there was already a change of tactics from nonviolence and mass protests to armed self-defense. And so with armed self-defense in the South in particular, that was already, in many ways, that was already a revolutionary act. Although many of the people who were doing it at that time and others didn't realize it. They realized it was a bold act, but not revolutionary, not something that could change this entire system. There was very few people that understood that. Maybe Robert Williams later on gave the perspective of that. But it was only natural at such a time that I would, be drawn to armed self-defense. And of course, Malcolm X spoke about this and had created a national organization and was trying to provide support to Black people in the South against white racists. Mm-hmm. He spoke of this in a lot of his meetings, and his organization that he'd built in New York City had actually was on its way to becoming a national organization. Mm-hmm. And so those things influenced me, as I ran into them. And but the period itself beckoned me to take further action. And so it was not a great step from for me to do that. I mean, it wasn't something that I had to make an audacious decision, maybe for myself to become part of it, but and everyone has to make that determination. But it was not something you had to make. You had to have some sort of heroic mass heroic commitment per se, a personal commitment. You didn't have to do that. And so to hijack a plane, to start carrying guns and different things like that were the things that were being done by activists in the South by the late 1960s. Not just in the North, with the rise of the Black Panther Party. That was fueled by the civil rights movement itself, practicing armed self-defense.
Yeah.
So that was what did it.
So you get to this place where authorities are pursuing you, and we've talked about this quite a bit, but you get to this place where authorities are pursuing you. You're in this era of skyjacking, when it was fairly regular for Black radicals to hijack planes to other countries to evade authorities or try to go start a new life somewhere else. And you do this, you hijack a plane to Cuba, and then you run into trouble with the Cuban government there. You're essentially deported to Czechoslovakia, where you run into more problems, and then you end up fleeing to East Germany, and you're captured and you're sent to prison, where you meet Martin Sostry, who then introduces you to anarchism. So let's jump to this place. I want to ask you, when you were in prison and Martin Sostre introduces you to anarchism and tells you about stateless socialism, tells you that there's another form of socialism as opposed to state socialism, and you begin this complete transformation. What keeps you going? What keeps you going in prison? What was it that after being imprisoned and after being pursued by authorities and confronted by authorities on multiple continents in several countries, what was it that kept you going in prison? I would imagine you would have been pretty disillusioned and frustrated. What was it that held you together?
Well, I was not disillusioned and maybe frustrated at being in prison, but I was not disillusioned at all.
Why weren't you?
It was at a time, it was at a historical time when, first of all, we'd gone through years of the civil rights and Black Power movement. We'd seen the rise of the New Left. We've seen, it was a revolutionary period still at that time. And people, just generally speaking, people gave respect to the idea of revolution, gave respect to the idea of radical social change and all that. It was a whole historical period where that was, I'm not going to say in vogue because that means it was some kind of fad, but no, it had taken deep root. And it came out of the civil rights movement originally, and then was transformed by Black Power, transformed by other movements, and became a real live radical and revolutionary threat. In fact, I contend that that period was a revolutionary period. I don't contend that the revolution was successful, but I contend that it was a revolutionary period. And so those are the things that, that gave myself and others hope, but also the prison movement by that time. By the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the prison movement had become extremely powerful in its own right, and had built a mass base for its organizing. And when the Attica Rebellion took place, it had to take place because it knew that it would get a favorable response from the people on the outside. They didn't know they were going to die, but they knew there was that distinct possibility that, and if they had to die, they knew that they were going to die for a specific set of beliefs and fighting back rather than laying down and dying and just like a dog. They didn't see it like that. And so it inspired a whole generation of young prison activists. And just in general, there was widespread radicalization among prisoners during this period. It was not the old gangster culture, and it was not just the, all the crazy stuff that happens in prison. There was a real belief that the prison struggle could accomplish something, even more than just winning rights for prisoners, was changing the nature of society that had people, especially Black people, locked up in prison in the first place, and had a culture that had to resort to this kind of oppression and repression by the state. So that was the thing that captivated my mind and kept me going for so many years. Plus, I was organizing in prison. I was an organizer. I carried out a lot of the things that Martin Sostre had given to me when I, as charges. When we talked, we carried out. We saw to it that revolutionary literature and his lawsuit that he filed against the prison officials in New York State was given national application, and so that prisoners all over the country would be able to receive Black literature, radical literature, and other so-called controversial books. And also that led to then political education, both the political education that was so-called unapproved by the authorities, as well as forcing the authorities to allow cultural studies programs inside the prisons and so forth. So it changed a great many things inside the space of prison. We were still in prison, but we were taking over the agenda in many respects inside the prison system. The officials were losing control of the way they had run the system in all these years. So that, it wasn't just a question of me as an individual, it was me belonging to a movement and a class of oppressed peoples who'd come to realization that our struggle was part of the civil rights, was part of the Black Power, was part of the New Left struggle, who recognized that fact. And so it became extremely important. And that was what motivated me. And of course, then you came with the other struggles in relation to prison labor.
So before I get into what I'm about to say, I want to let everybody know that's watching that we will do a Q&A here in a bit. So you can drop some questions in the Q&A, and we'll try our best to get to a few of them at the end. So please ask your questions. But what you were just pointing to, Lorenzo, is a connectivity and an understanding about seeing yourself and threading yourself into a larger struggle, into a larger movement, and kind of rising above a self-important view of yourself and your life in the larger scheme of things. And I think that is something that a lot of people don't always do. So I admire that when I talk to you. I admire your humility about your life in that regard. And I want to ask you, Black history feels so distant, I feel like, to younger generations when, it's alive right now. I'm talking to you right now as somebody who is a pivotal part of Black history. And it's elders like yourself that, can inform and guide a lot of our movements today. So how do you think about the not so distant past when you reflect on the course of your life? How do you feel about it now, looking back? How do you feel about these moments that you're talking about?
Well, without struggles like this, and that period in the 1960s, and there have been other periods for us as going even back further that were different, but without that particular period, and that's the period when Black people and the Black struggle came of age as an independent movement, as an independent movement. Without that, we would not be in any position at this point to do anything. So whatever mistakes are made and so forth and so on, and that's led us to the point where now people are still willing to fight, but they're being misled by the so-called leaders and politicians and all the other elements of the state, the sideshow. And we're being prevented from taking the kind of action that took place in the 1960s. It's not something special about myself or about the activists in that period. It's just that in that moment, in that historical moment, things became possible that had not been possible before. And people took advantage of it and mobilized and organized and was able to change their existence as it stood right then. Now, like every struggle, there's going to be cases where there's a struggle, people get killed, people get imprisoned, and what have you. And that's the price of freedom, of fighting for freedom. That's the price of it. Somebody's going to die, somebody's going to be imprisoned. And just so those that follow can have a better life. It doesn't mean they're going to be completely free. We would love for that to be the case. And so for me, I look at the things that happened back then, and I continue to reflect on it to understand it. And then I look at from the standpoint of being an eyewitness to history. I'm not an instrumental person that made everything happen. That's not who I am. I'm a person who was an eyewitness to history, saw it happen, take the lessons of it, have been thinking about it long term for many, many years and continue to do so. And then I'm able, hopefully, to train other organizers in this period. We need revolutionary community organizers in this period to carry out the struggle as they see it in this period and onward. And that is essentially what an oppressed people have to do in order to get freedom. They have to go through, we're not the only people that have had hundreds of years of oppression and then become free. Some people think that they become disillusioned and frustrated and with the entire thing. And they think that because we haven't gotten free in 10 years or whatever, or 2 years, that somehow we're inferior. That isn't the way it works. We have the most powerful enemy in the world. We have the most powerful enemy in the world. And the reality is our generation has to pick up, every generation has to pick up its sword, weapon, whatever, what have you, but pick up its ability to fight back, to challenge, and to overthrow the system that exists at that time. Now, when I say overthrow it, in the 60s, we overthrew segregation. We overthrew certain types of police brutality and so forth and so on. You know, we were able to do some things, and continuing on down the line, you know, over the years, I've been involved in a lot of struggles, and they have not been something where I've been given some plaque or some plaudit. You know what I'm saying? I use the truth is, in most instances, when you're a grassroots organizer, you do the work, you never see the benefit, and you never get any credit. Sometimes the opportunists will come along and try to even take that away from you. Right. So if you're motivated by just recognition, you're motivated by the wrong things, you know. So for me, I've always recognized that I'm part of a process, part of a broad-based movement that's trying to change the world. And we may use different tactics, maybe even having a different strategy to some degree, but we're trying to all get to the same place, presumably. You know, right. We're trying to get there.
Right. Let's get into some of these questions, Lorenzo, because I see some interesting questions in the chat here. One of the first ones I'm seeing is, what type of actions were you doing during your anarchist period in prison or otherwise? What type of, you were talking about organizing, so can you maybe give us a response to what you were getting into there?
Well, I was involved in a number of different campaigns. One, for instance, not the first campaign, but one of the most important was around prison labor. Yeah. And, you know, a lot of people don't even realize that in the late, the mid to late 1970s, prisoners had formed were on the verge of forming a national prison labor union, and had organized somewhere around 40,000 prisoners, and was in most states. And I was involved with that, especially in the federal prison system, and had made contacts with other prisoners in other states and so forth. So I was pushing to have that union. And of course, it was crushed by the officials who went to the Supreme Court. And of course, the Supreme Court decided on behalf of the authorities, just as you would expect they would. And then, you know, that doomed the struggle. You know, when they went to the legalism, both on both sides, that pretty much doomed the struggle. That's some theory and fighting on his own behalf. But in addition to that, you know, I was one of the people pushing for you know, improving the conditions for prisoners. Obviously, I wanted prisoners to get out. I advocated for amnesty and so forth. I always have over the years, but I also got involved as an anarchist in the campaign against prison itself. I got into the Anarchist Black Cross. I was the first American, maybe Martin Sostry, but I certainly one of the first Americans to be adopted by the Anarchist Black Cross in London. That, you know, started by Stuart Christie and Albert Meltzer, and who were long-standing anarchists. You know, one of them had been a political prisoner himself in Spain. You know, but so I got involved with that, and I helped to build the Anarchist Black Cross as a movement all over the world. And I worked with you know, movements against racism inside the prisons, You know, what the officials like to do, what prison officials like to do, and the way they had always controlled the prisons was to use racists in the form of white supremacists, prisoners or guards or whatever, and use terror inside the prison, racial terror, to try to control the prison population. And so I hadn't been in prison that long, and I read Prison Letters of George Jackson, where he talked about that and explained how that was a strategic objective of the government and of the corporation. I'm sorry, and of the prison administration. And so I'm not going to say that every white person loved us or whatever, you know what I'm saying, but we had created a radical class of whites inside the prison, even the racist prison I had gone to. By the time they singled me out and tried to kill me and all, that's a whole different story. But, you know, by the time that we had taken this radical prison library, which was related to the Black Studies program, we actually had white people in solitary confinement, white prisoners, asking for literature. Wow. They wanted, you know, they had been, we had radicalized them. I had no idea, none whatsoever, how we had radicalized them inside that prison when we were fighting against the Klan, and many of the whites rose up against the Klan, and had controlled that prison for so many years with the guards and the authorities and the racist prisoners. We defeated that and so forth. And so we had radicalized these prisoners, man, and we'd done all kind of stuff. And you know, I was not there to see this happen, but there was a huge strike that took place. They beat me almost within an inch of my life and transferred me down to a behavior modification program in Springfield, Missouri. So, but I left and I found out later about these things that happened there, and, you know, and that prison was never the same. They had a big strike there, and I mean, so things were moving that I was taking part of. I could see the impact of it. It's one thing if you had something happen and maybe 10 years, 20 years go by, and then you see the impact of it. And sometimes that's the way it is. But that was almost immediate because we were in the immediacy of the struggle, of the prison struggle. The prison struggle had become a central issue in America, in American life, in American left. It was a central issue. So I was part of that. And the anarchist movement, by being in the anarchist movement, you know, in the anarchist Black Cross and all this, I was able to have a voice. And ultimately, the movement I had built, along with the anarchist Black Cross and these other things, pushed me out of prison. That may sound ridiculous, pushing me out of prison, but that's effectively what's happened. That's what happened with Martin Sostry. He was pushed out of prison. His voice and what had happened to him had gone all over the world. People saw the outrageous nature of it. They knew what racism was. Even people who lived in all white countries knew what racism was because he politically educated them about what a racist place America and Buffalo, New York was. You know what I'm saying? He educated them. He was an articulate Black man. You know, they always try to project Black people like we're some beasts or animal and we have no ability to articulate. And so one of the first times people saw what happened in Attica and saw these people who realized that many of them were going to die, but who stood up anyway and who said that the principle of human rights, of the ability of a human being to live with dignity is more important than the individuality of my life. That's a hell of a thing to say. And I had gotten to that stage as well inside the prison. It's just a wonder I wasn't killed. I mean, it's just a wonder. I was beaten within an inch of my life. I was brutalized. I had all the skin off my face and head at one point, shaved off because I'd gotten so much mace, chemical spray on me, and I almost went blind. And so, I mean, it's not like they weren't trying to kill me. It wasn't like they, weren't trying to brutalize me. I was consistently brutalized. But it's not as something about me as an individual or some hero. I never, ever try to project it like that. I'm a survivor, first of all, because most people who went through that died in there. I learned from Martin Sostry, who was one of my best teachers, and he got out alive. And nobody expected him to get out alive. I don't even think that at some point, and when I talked to him, he wasn't absolutely sure he was going to get out alive. He wasn't sure. I mean, let's be honest about it. When you go to prison, we got 40 odd years, or you got natural life, which is what I had when I went to prison, two natural life sentences. You don't know if you're coming out alive. You could be stabbed and killed on the inside over some, so for some reason, the prison officials could have you murdered. These things go on all the time. I've seen it, and I almost was killed, a number of occasions, because officials would try to provoke a situation where I could be killed.
Right.
But the anarchist movement is, in that sense, the prison movement and the worldwide anarchist movement, I don't necessarily credit these people in America, but the worldwide anarchist movement helped me stay alive.
Okay. So let's be considerate of time. I want to say we'll probably give another 10 minutes to this Q&A, but I want to combine two questions I'm seeing here, and this has been coming up a bit. So one of the questions is, can you address the criticism from state communists who say that you wrongly blamed Cuba's underdeveloped state on the Cuban government instead of the US, who have imposed sanctions on the country since the completion of their revolution? Now, before you get to that, the other question I want to combine here is, we have friends from all over the world. Can Lorenzo talk about internationalism and how they connected the struggles of the US outside against a common enemy? So these two questions here that I want to ask you about is, can you clarify for people, when you talk about your experience in Cuba, your experience in Czechoslovakia, and your experience in East Germany, and what you encountered with state socialism, there seems to be some confusion for people thinking that you're blaming the people that live in those countries, and that you're not addressing imperialism, or you're not being fair to those state socialist structures. Can you address that? And can you talk about your views on anti-imperialism? And can you also talk about internationalism, and just kind of address your views on these things as a whole and clarify them for people, so we can get a response from you on that?
Well, when I was in Cuba, this was at a time when the Cuban government had a problem with one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, Eldridge Cleaver. Right. And as a result of that, now this happened shortly before I got there. And because of that problem that they had, security problem or whatever you want to call it, with the Cuban government and Eldridge Cleaver, they retaliated against people who were in the Black Panther Party, or were known to be members of the Black Panther Party. And they were afraid because it was purportedly Eldridge Cleaver had stated that he was going to create a Havana Black Panther Party and so forth and so on. And they were afraid of that, and saw that as a security threat. And so they couldn't take action against him, retaliatory action, and put him in jail or something or other. But those of us who were not known, or whatever the case may be, were in fact rounded up. Many of us were rounded up or persecuted and put in prison. And some people were put in. I was put in prison for less than a year, and then I was shipped out of the country. That's what eventually happened in my case. They wanted to know would I leave, and yes, I left. Well, others stayed there, and some stayed in prison for 2 and 3 years, and they stayed in the country years afterwards. Now, even though they stayed in the country, they honestly told people what the conditions were like that happened to them. They told about it within the context of how it happened. And there's a book by an ex-Black Panther member who hijacked a plane to Cuba, named William Lee Brent is his name. And his book is called Long Time Gone. And he stayed in Cuba 20-some years. Well, in that book, he explains exactly the kind of stuff I was saying that happened in terms of them persecuting Black Panthers at that particular time that we're talking about in the '69. And turning around and putting them in jail, and some were kept in jail. Some of them were put on, you know, out in the fields to, you know, chop cotton or whatnot, sugarcane, and so forth. And people did that for years. So I refused to do that. I refused to do that. And I was sent out of the country. Well, they assumed I refused to do that. They shipped me out of the country. Now, that did not endear me. My being locked up in Cuba did not endear me to, you know, with the state socialist methods. I mean, it wasn't like I went to get a trial or something or other. I was just put in solitary confinement for several months and then shipped out of the country. Then after I was out of the country, they were so hostile towards me that they were trying to give me over to the Americans, or encouraging me to go to the Americans and turn myself in. And I refused to do that. And point of fact, some of the Black students that were around that, you know, there was a strong Black students union in Czechoslovakia where I was, in Prague, and they saw this happening and they intervened, in fact, and everything. And when I was thrown out of this hotel by, you know, where I was being financed by the Cubans, they took me into you know, their one of their youth hostels and kept me there. But the Cubans managed to get me, or to tell the Czechoslovakians about me, and the Czechs actually picked me up and took me to the American consulate, the American consulate. And I was arrested and I was on my way back to the United States, but I escaped. And I went to East Germany, and there, one of the students' brother was going to help me get out the country and get me to Africa. That didn't happen. I was captured, brought back to the United States eventually. I was kept in Berlin for some time, then brought back to the United States. So
do you conflate those experiences that you had with the populations of those countries, or do you view them as a state issue? Like, that's one of the parts that, like, how do you feel with regard to again, internationalism and anti-imperialism when you're thinking about these things that you experience, and how do you feel about the populations of those countries, the people who live in those countries, and how are you processing all of these things? Because I think that what these questions are getting at is, do you conflate the experiences that you had with the populations of that country, or do you view it as a separate issue, as something that informs your anarchism and your views about the state as a whole? Can you explain more of that?
Well, obviously, if you went through certain circumstances within a country, you're going to have some understanding of the problems of that country in the way that it treats you. But that isn't the whole story for me. I mean, I became an anarchist and an anti-statist for ideological reasons, you know, as opposed to just the personal stuff that happened to me in Cuba. I do think that, you know, that was, you know, Cuba's an authoritarian society, just like all the rest of them are. I don't make any great distinction that somehow there's a so-called revolutionary government or I don't believe in that. That I think that's nonsensical. I think that the history shows us, even with all this rhetoric about anti-imperialism and the differences between states and this, that, and other, the so-called American states, or the so-called American style states, along with the Europeans and the so-called socialist state and all the rest of them, have got histories of persecution and oppression. Every one of them. It may differ. In the United States, it's slavery slavery of the African population, and consistently over the years of oppression of workers and the poor. You know, you got that. Well, in Russia and Cuba, there are different types of oppression. They had a revolution and overthrew an American type dictator, or American finance dictator. And I think that's a good thing. Historically, that's a good thing. But that does not mean that we look at them and have no criticism whatsoever. And my criticism of the whole question of authoritarian governments, and especially so-called authoritarian socialist states, is the same kind of criticism I have for all of them, wherever they are in the world, whether it's the Soviet Union. It may be some different. I understand that there's differences in terms of the population, in terms of the history and so forth and so on. But it's still an authoritarian state. They murdered millions of their own workers and poor people. And they also oppressed. They used methods of obtaining power that was oppressive, and they maintained the power that was oppressive. And so if you look at that, and you look at, you know, the mass murders, for instance, that took place in Cambodia, what does he call it? And you look at the mass murders that took place there of the population, and then you look at you know, issues beyond the actual revolution itself, but you look at what happened to the populations of these countries by these administrations. You'd almost have to say that they have committed crimes themselves, not just the capitalists or the capitalist stage. They have committed crimes themselves in holding on to power, you know. And so that's where I'm at with that. I don't have any special thing for Cuba. I don't have any special adulation of the Cuban government or of the Cuban Revolution. I don't have any adulation of it like some people do. But at the same time, I don't have any condemnation generally of a country that fought to overthrow American imperialist control of their country and of the Latin American region, you know. But
yeah,
you know,
it's I think that when you bring up that issue of a lot of the death and a lot of the atrocity that has happened in the name of state socialist experiments, that it does kind of connect to a lot of the other things you talked about in your life, with this willingness to criticize leadership and representatives and people that hold power within a movement or within a government. And I think that it's really actually, I think when I listen to you talk, that it's connected to a kind of consistent thread throughout your life of a willingness to address inconsistency and contradiction in leadership and in representation, and so on and so forth, whether that's in a movement or whether that's somebody who's a representative or a person who holds power within the state. But I don't want to get completely stuck on that. I just want to combine those questions for you and kind of get some of your response. I want to ask maybe one or two more questions.
Well, I didn't finish on internationalism, though.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Internationalism is distinct in my mind from all of that, you know. Just because you don't support some leader or some particular state or something or other does not mean that you're not an internationalist. Right. And to me, internationalism is about the workers and the poor, not about dictators, not about corrupt political parties and so forth and so on, or oppressive political parties. You know, I think that we need to recognize that we unite with the struggles of the people. Yes. To overthrow oppression. We don't unite with a particular dictator or some phony politician or whatever. You know, we see that these people are in league. In fact, many of them are in bed with imperialism, or in bed with the banks, or in bed with whatever type of foreign bureaucrat or foreign bureaucratic regime that wants to control their country. They're in bed with them. So we say that our support is of the masses of people, and that's the highest form of internationalism, not this rhetoric about some party, some political party, or some corrupt, gang cabal of so-called leaders and so forth. We've seen that. We've seen how many people have been destroyed and how countries have been destroyed with Stalin and with Lenin and with other people who practice dictatorial methods. People want to excuse that. They want to excuse that. They want to excuse the blood, excuse the genocide and so forth, and say it's for a higher motive. We kill, but we kill for a higher motive. It's different when you're fighting a war against an actual enemy, as opposed to making your own population group or segments of your own population group or ideological opponents. Just remember that these people wiped out the anarchists in every country we were in. When we were a political force, it wasn't like there was some sort of political truce or some kind of political acceptance. They wiped out forces. And now they want us to somehow look upon them as being victimized. No, it don't work that way. I know a lot more about it than that they can run that past me. They got, when your hands dripping with blood and you run authoritarian states yourself, then you have to take accountability for that. We have to make you take accountability for it. That's what we have to do. Now, as I said, that's different from internationalism. I don't consider that to be internationalism whatsoever. We talk about internationalism, anarchists talk about internationalism in terms of people's struggles, in terms of, solidarity, and, actual solidarity with oppressed peoples. That's what we call international. I've gone all over the world. I've gone more places around the world in the name of anarchism and being an anarchist than most of the people who are asking me these questions have been on the earth, And so I've seen a lot of struggles. I've seen a lot of things that have happened. I've made contacts with people. I've won people over who would never even look at anarchism. Like, for instance, most Black people wouldn't even look at anarchism if it had not been for me and the book Anarchism and the Black Revolution and so forth. I'm not saying that because I'm looking to get patted on the back. I'm just saying it as a fact. So I get it where people are always asking me, well, what about internationalism? What they're really asking, though, I think in most instances, is the idea that they don't feel Black people having the right to organize, first of all, and they, as an anarchist, and they also don't feel that our claims for freedom and ability to have autonomous struggles have any validity. We have to always be, as they call unity. They call it unity, following them, whatever they say, wherever they're going. Or, the white hero is going to save us all. So
okay.
I think we have to go beyond that.
Yeah. Okay. So this will be the last question. What can be done to help other Black people and ultimately all victims of oppression realize the revolutionary they're in, whether they acknowledge it or not, is worth fighting for?
Now, what was that? I didn't get that.
What can be done to help other Black people and ultimately all victims of oppression realize the revolutionary struggle they're in is worth fighting for?
Well, first of all, you got to be. Let me explain something about organizing. And why I put emphasis on revolutionary community organizing. You have to reach the people with their message, not your message. People don't get that. You have to reach the people with their message. You have to be able to politically educate people. And political education is not having a book like a Bible and use some kind of rote learning technique. It is, raising radical ideas about everyday problems, building alternative political and economic structures so that people can survive, to give them a path forward, and connecting with people, becoming part of the masses of people. And we are, as my wife always points out to me, we are part of the masses. We are not distinct from the masses of people, even the most poor and desperate masses of people. We're not distinct from them. I know it's a certain level of arrogance among these paid activists, that they got a certain level of arrogance that they're somehow better than the people they're going to see, that we're a case. We're a case. Poor people are a case for them, as opposed to being an ally and trying to transform the world. So I think that, the whole idea is that we organize, we reach the masses of people with a message. We then begin to build alternative structures in the community, or transform the structures in the community, and we build dual power and direct action, not direct action, I'm sorry. We build dual power, direct democracy. I'm sorry. That's what happens when you get old, see.
Hey, no, I got it for you, man. I got your back.
All right. I'm sorry.
No, you good.
But yeah, that's what we need to do. That. In fact, we need to take the ideas, just the ideas of anarchism. I've been trying to tell people this for years. They think I'm crazy or stupid or whatever. Take the ideas and make them into political programs. When I say political programs, I mean actual programs, so that people can link to it. So make it as an alternative. I would say that we create dual power and as an alternative to what City Hall is doing, or what the government is doing. We create an alternative structure, economic and social structure. So even an economy on a local level, that we take and build an alternative to electoral politics generally. And once we're able to do these kinds of things, we can see people mistake or don't understand the whole power of people arriving at revolutionary consciousness.
Right.
Not that you're going to lecture them and everybody looks like you and everybody thinks like you and so forth and so on. What about people who don't look like you? What about people who don't think like you? Right. And this has been the problem with anarchism and leftism, period. White leftism generally. They leave out people of color. They leave out Black people and others. And if they do want to link to them, it's like we did in the 60s, they want to link to a struggle that's already fighting and on the verge of victory. They want to link to it so they can control it and take it in another direction or whatever, what have you. And so that's what I think. We use ideas as actual programs to bring people into a space, to bring people into a new way of living, and ultimately a new way of fighting back.
Right.
Beautiful.
I mean, that's it, man. I think that's a great way to end. And I think you actually answered two questions at once with that. So I appreciate that response as well. I think that we will go ahead and wrap it up. I want to say thank you to everyone who has watched. This has been an amazing conversation filled with so much Black history. And Lorenzo, always appreciate you sharing all these different parts of your life and trying to help people ask questions that need to be asked and challenge dogma and think about new ways of trying to create movement and to make the world better. Everybody go pick up Anarchism and the Black Revolution from Pluto Press and support Lorenzo's work. This is a legendary book. It's a huge thing that is out now in the world for the first time in this way. With this definitive edition, go read it, ask questions, have conversations with your community, with your friends and family. And any last words, Lorenzo, before we head out?
Well, I'm working, and I'm gonna be like the commercial said, never not working, but I'm working on a book right now that is a history of Black autonomy as the origin for Black anarchism in this period, and onward. So it talks about the work we did, but it also talks about the importance of having an example of people doing the work that people could latch to in this period and in the years to come, having an actual example of people who worked in the community, who were anarchists and so forth. People don't understand the difficulty of pushing a car uphill, with a rope. And they don't understand how difficult it is to do that. But the importance of doing it opens the door for people in this period and for years to come to be able to hear and to read some of the things that we wrote, not just because I wrote it or something or other, but because it lays a history of struggle, or from an activist, an activist who was engaged in the struggle, and it provides a method. And without that, sometimes things can't happen as fast as you want it to. It took all these years just to get here. Anarchism and Black Revolution is 43 years old now, and written inside of a prison cell. And then there's me, was an anarchist, has been an anarchist for 53 years. I didn't realize this until I started doing this particular book. Can you imagine that? 53 years now that I've been an anarchist, and yet there's a lot of people don't accept me, for their own reasons, whether their reasons are personal or political. I'm not going to debate all that, but they don't want to accept me, and they don't want to accept the book because they don't want to see a book coming from a Black activist that has this kind of importance. Now, that's sad that people would still hold these views, and I know there's not as many today as there was before, but I'm just telling you what I experienced over the years.
Right.
And it should have been much better accepted by the overall movement, even if they didn't agree with everything I had to say.
Yeah. Well, I think that this event and others like it that have preceded and that will follow are an indication that things have changed quite a bit, and this has been a monumental thing to see take place. So I'm glad. I saw one of the last times we had a conversation, somebody commented and said to tell you to let you know that people are reading your book and they are talking about it and they are enjoying it. So I think that something to be proud of, man. And yeah, everybody go check it out. And again, thanks for tuning in today. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, Pluto. And yeah, I think we're going to wrap it up. Everybody have a good rest of your evening and stay safe out here during these times.
Love and struggle.
Love and struggle.